Growing up during the infancy of video gaming, I was fortunate enough to have experienced firsthand the dark and dingy crowded arcade rooms brimming with annoyingly loud and bright flashy cabinets. I was introduced to video games at the perfect time, when vast adventures could unfold within a single video monitor, where several different boards would greet you with difficult waves of baddies, eagerly waiting to gobble up your next quarter. I began playing at such a young age, my father would have to lift me up in order for me to even see the screen. I found games like Pac-Man and Burger Time enchanting, not to mention addicting, and there were many more that I grew up with that did nothing but solidify my love for one-screen arcade classics. But out of all of these, my favorites of the bunch were undoubtedly created by none other than the Big N. Before Nintendo became the household name that it is today, I had heard of that name before, from what I remember being the very first game that I had ever played, Donkey Kong. Released in arcades shortly after Reagan's run-in with John McKinley back in '81, Donkey Kong is the titular villain who kidnaps Jumpman's old lady Pauline, who then seeks sanctuary within a construction site. The sour simian tosses barrels down on Jumpman from atop steel girders, while at the same time, the protagonist has to avoid other hazards such as flames. Jumping is the hero's main evasive maneuver, hence the name Jumpman. Created by Shigeru Miyamoto, the same genius behind the Mario and Zelda games, Donkey Kong was way ahead of its time and is arguably the genesis of the platformer. I credit this game as the gateway drug that turned me into a lifelong gaming addict. The immense popularity of Donkey Kong resulted in numerous home ports to such consoles as the Atari 2600, or what I grew up with, the ColecoVision. At the time, the Coleco version was the closest looking arcade-to-home port on the market. It blew me away. So that being said, you can only imagine how impressed I was with the NES port when it was released in 1985. Looking pretty much identical to the arcade version, the NES port of Donkey Kong is as close as one can get to the arcade experience without repeatedly jamming quarters into a slot. Some visual adjustments had to be made due to the difference in size of a television screen versus that of an arcade cabinet. The sound effects also differ slightly, with me preferring the nostalgic sounds of the classic arcade machine. Some omissions were also made. The arcade's intro scene, in which Donkey Kong climbs up two ladders with Pauline in hand, was cut from the home version. A graphic of a goofy-looking DK that shows up in between stages indicating the height of the current stage was also removed from the NES port. And so was an entire stage. Apparently, due to memory limitations, the Cement Factory board, which doesn't show up until later waves within the arcade version, is absent from the NES one altogether. And speaking of the stages, here's a strange one. The stages on the US Donkey Kong arcade are out of order. I'm not exactly sure why the stages were mixed up when localizing Donkey Kong here in the States, but the NES version puts them in the correct order. I remember as a kid, this confused the hell out of me, since all I had played up until the NES version were the arcade and ColecoVision Donkey Kongs, both of which featured the out-of-order Americanized version of the levels. But doesn't it make much more sense that Donkey Kong would fall on his head and Pauline rescued within the final stage of each wave and not the second? Yeah, it does. With the success of Donkey Kong, Nintendo wasted little time in releasing a sequel in 1982. In Donkey Kong Jr., the roles are reversed, as this time around, Donkey Kong is the one captured in a fit of revenge from none other than Jumpman, who by this time has been renamed Mario. In only his second game, the first one where he is actually named Mario, Nintendo's mascot plays the role of antagonist, the only time Mario would ever be cast as the leading villain. But villain he is, and it's up to Donkey Kong Jr. to rescue his beloved Papa from the evil clutches of the vile, mustachioed miscreant. Donkey Kong Jr. took what made its predecessor so great and added even more. While there was climbing in the form of ladders in the original, Donkey Kong Jr. introduces vines, which require much more climbing and maneuvering. Mario sets off mechanized Snapjaws after Jr., coupled with vicious birds, who stop at nothing to impede our heroic chimp from rescuing Daddy Ape. The NES graphics are near identical to the arcade version. As a kid, I couldn't tell the difference, and despite already having the game on the ColecoVision, I still asked for the NES version when I received the console. You see, at the time, Donkey Kong Jr. was my all-time favorite game, and if I could play an arcade version on my home television, then I was all about it. Like Donkey Kong, the NES sound effects are slightly different than the arcade versions. I actually prefer the sound effects on the NES this time around. Those arcade sound effects are booty! But just like the NES version of Donkey Kong, liberties were also taken with its sequel. Following its predecessor's lead, the screen size called for some alterations. And again, just like the arcade version of Donkey Kong, the stages in Junior are out of order. The same thing was done here as in the original. The second stage in the arcade is the one where Junior busts Donk out of a cage, who then proceeds to give Mario a boot to the ass. The NES version simply outs Donk from his cage, in turn sending Mario falling to his death. At least he's a good Christian. The NES version corrects this, properly setting the stage at the end of each wave. Also, the fourth electric stage was not removed from the NES game. This stage was missing from the Coleco version. Some other small differences were also made. The intro, where Mario and his doppelganger, don't worry Luigi, you'll be introduced soon, pull up and imprison Donkey Kong on pulleys, was completely removed from the NES version. Also, each time a key is placed within a lock in the arcade version, its corresponding piece of the cage will be removed. The cage stays intact until completed in the NES one. The NES port of Donkey Kong Jr. is exceptional. It comes as close to the arcade version as possible and is arguably even better.
I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm strong to the finish, 'cause I eats me spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
1982 was also the year that Nintendo released Popeye to arcades. Shigeru Miyamoto for some reason had a real stiffy for Popeye, with the original Donkey Kong intended to be a Popeye game, but was later changed to a cast of original characters when the Popeye license fell through. I guess he has a thing for drunken surly sailors. I don't know. So anyway, when the license was finally approved after the success of Donkey Kong, Miyamoto and crew began working on a brand new game based off of the Mumbling Mariner. Popeye is unique in that the eponymous character is unable to jump whatsoever in this early platformer. He can only throw punches. Popeye ascends and descends stairs, collecting Olive Oil's love, songs, and cries for help, all of the while avoiding his arch nemesis, Brutus. Having to steer clear of one main baddie on a single screen as opposed to several was a bit different for its time, akin to the ghosts who chase after Pac-Man. Yes, the Sea Hag does show up occasionally to toss skulls, but Brutus is the main hazard throughout the game. But also like the ghosts in Pac-Man, Brutus can be temporarily removed from the board if Popeye happens to get his hands on a can of spinach. This gives him temporary invincibility. Simply touching Brutus will send him careening into the water below. The game is made up of 3 stages, all of which are in the same order. The 2 versions look very similar, but Popeye is actually the game that made me notice that the NES Arcade Series ports are not as close to the arcade versions as I had originally presumed. The character sprites and animation for the 1982 arcade are phenomenal for its time. The characters all look very cartoon-like, while in the NES version, not so much. The Sea Hag in the NES version is hardly recognizable. And the title screens are completely different, with the arcade displaying a graphic of Popeye's profile. The intro, like the prior 2 games before it, was removed from the NES version. In Stage 1, the arcade version has a ladder that can only be descended. In the NES version, you can go both up and down, as this same ladder now reaches the bottom of the floor. The second stage has a springboard that can be used to evade Brutus. You'll be thrown up to catch Sweet Pea, who also makes an appearance in the game. In the arcade version, Wimpy awaits on the other side of the springboard, which acts like a teeter-totter. His weight is what sends you flying through the air. The NES version? Gone. No Wimpy.
I'd gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today.
I guess he couldn't pay off his hamburger debt and is now mysteriously missing. Science be damned, Popeye can still fly up to Sweet Pea, wimpy or no wimpy. The sound is almost identical, with the NES port being very close to the arcade one. The biggest difference are those graphics, though. I grew up with Popeye and the ColecoVision, so the desire to play a near-perfect arcade port has always intrigued me. But the NES version is as close as you can possibly get, and it is still a really fun time. Probably my favorite of the five here, Mario Bros. Was released in 1983. With Miyamoto playing the role of King Midas, he created pure gold with this one. A two-player simultaneous affair, Mario returns, this time with younger brother Luigi, amongst a deluge of pipes crawling with critters. The plumbing duo has to bump the baddies who litter each stage from below before kicking them off of the board for good. This mechanic was brilliantly conceived within an era already saturated with copycat clones. Once again, following their uncompromised mantra that remains true to this day, Nintendo did things differently. Although I had enjoyed Mario Bros. In the past, especially with the remade version available on every Super Mario Advance title, it wasn't until I downloaded the NES version on the Wii that I was truly sucked in. I would spend hours playing a single game, getting better and better each time. I ended up resetting the stages past 99, and thanks to the Wii, I was able to save this top score. Yeah, I freaking love this game, which is why I wasted little time plunking quarters into the arcade machine the last time I hit up the local barcade called 1-Up. This was the first time I had noticed the differences. Naturally, the title screens are different, and while the graphics are very similar, the arcade version simply looks better. The animation on the shell creepers while on their backs looked much cooler in the arcade version. Mario's hat color is swapped on the NES version, and his mustache is blue as opposed to the arcade's brown. The character sprites just look better overall on the coin-op machine. Short tutorials are also shown on the arcade version as new baddies are introduced. These are absent from the NES one. The sound effects are also different. While similar, I really don't care for the arcade sound of Mario and Luigi's footsteps. I noticed this even though I was surrounded by overly loud, blaring arcade machines. This game was obviously the precursor to the most popular and famous video game franchise of all time. Luigi makes his first appearance. Coins and turtles are introduced. And pipes. Fireballs are also present. We all know how this story unfolds. For a 35-year-old game, Mario Bros. Is still addictive as all hell. It probably ranks as my #1 single-screen arcade classic title, and as much as I would have loved to have captured some two-player NES footage, well, have you ever tried to play Mario Bros. With someone who doesn't know what the hell they're doing? It's not a pretty sight.
Mamma mia!
And the last game here is the final one in the Donkey Kong trilogy, Donkey Kong 3. Now, you may not have ever remembered seeing this one at the arcade. God knows I don't, and there are several reasons for that. Donkey Kong goes apeshit and finds himself holed up in a greenhouse. Like a bull in a china shop, Donk lays waste to anything he comes in contact with. He swats at bees' nests, which only angers the little buggers. As Stanley the Bugman, you have to drive Donkey Kong out of the greenhouse by firing bug spray up his ass. Say what? No Mario? Strike one. Stanley can hop up and down from floor to floor, but has to avoid pesky insects on top of saving his plants. Using his canister of bug spray, Stanley fires straight up and moves from side to side to dispose of swarms of bothersome bugs. Kinda like Galaga. Ooh, strike two. The game was also released during the beginning of the infamous video game crash of the early 80s. Strike three? All of these factors undoubtedly played a role in why Donkey Kong 3 has remained for the most part largely unpopular. Which is a shame, because you know what? It's really fun. Like all the others before it, Donkey Kong 3's title screen differs on both versions. The graphics are better in the arcade, with more detail to the character sprites, swarms of bugs flying from the hives which are not present in the home version, and the outline of a greenhouse in the background. Donkey Kong also has a plethora of facial expressions as opposed to the NES version. How would you look if you got a cold spray of DDT up your bunghole? There are a few animations left out of the NES version as well. For instance, during the second stage, Donkey Kong falls to the floor after finishing the level. Not in the home version. And when Stanley dies, the bugs swarm over him like Carry On in the hot sun. This doesn't happen in the NES game either, but man, I just love that instrumental elegy that plays afterwards. The music throughout the game is almost the same, with the arcade boasting more sound channels, and the sound effects are almost identical. Don't be discouraged by the lack of Mario in this one, or the fact that the game is a shooter disguised as a platformer. Donkey Kong 3 is a blast! Up the butt. So these are the 5 arcade series games developed by Nintendo. They're all winners and definitely worth checking out. If you grew up playing these types of arcade games and missed out on any one of these 5, check them out on the NES. All of them are more than adequate arcade ports, and in some cases, arguably better at home. The entire arcade series is worthy of their arcade counterparts and are still timeless classics today. While I can't stand the way Nintendo does and has done business in the past, there's no denying that the Big N were innovators at the time and made some damn fine games.
A gorilla! Help! 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 Hi,
Mario, help. Come back here, you lump of fur!